Well, it's my privilege today on the Macquarie Street Political Podcast to be joined by Gerard Henderson, who is the Executive Director of the Sydney Institute. It's a very influential forum for discussion and debate. Gerard is the author of many books, including Menzies' Child, which is a history of the Liberal Party in Australia, and also the author of a book which I enjoyed some years ago called Santa Maria, A Most Unusual Man, and a great inspiration. Gerard, thanks very much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Lyle.
Gerard, your latest book is Cardinal Pell, The Media Pylon and Collective Guilt, and that's what we want to talk about today. But before we get into the details of the Cardinal Pell trial and all that surrounds this, I just wanted to set the scene. Obviously, this opens up a discussion that is very sensitive for many people who have been sexually abused. And of course, there's been this scourge of child sexual abuse in Australia, sadly, in many of our churches and elsewhere. And I just want to set the context here because I think there's been some misconceptions. Obviously, the first misconception we want to do away with is the fact that any of us would tolerate this. It's heinous, and I think that goes without saying. But in the book, you point out, and I think you get these figures from the various, might be the Royal Commission itself, that between 1950 and 2015, there were 4,445 alleged cases of child sexual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church, 4,765 claims, and that most of these occurred between 1950 and 1989, well before people like Cardinal Pell rose to really prominent positions of leadership. And also you quote the Honourable Justice McClellan, the chair of the Royal Commission into institutional abuse of children, where he says the number of children who are sexually abused in familial, i.e. family situations or other circumstances, far exceeds those abused in institutions, which of course include the church.
Well, that was in the conclusion of the Royal Commission. Justice Peter McClellan said that it was mainly in familial circumstances within families that most child abuse occurred. The problem was that the Royal Commission was the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. So the Royal Commission only had a remit to look at institutions like the Catholic Church or other churches, or it didn't really look much at government institutions. It looked at some of them. It focused mainly on the churches. But they were looking at institutional responses, not what was happening now or what had happened a month or even some years ago. They're looking at how institutions responded to the issue. And in relation to the Catholic Church, I mean, those figures are there, but the child sexual abuse within elements of the Catholic Church historically was quite absolutely scandalous and very serious crimes. But I make the point of that figure of 4,445, that figure. Now, what that amounts to is about, of the complainants within institutions, within religious institutions, not all institutions, but religious institutions, something like 60% were in Catholic institutions. So these are complaints, they're not all established facts. But at the time, the Catholic Church would have had about 80% of children in institutions, because as you know, the Catholics ran their own school system. They had more orphanages, they had hospitals. So in a sense, the figures sort of focused, and the Royal Commission overwhelmingly focused on the Catholic Church and to some extent the Anglican Church. But the figures show that whilst the figures within the Catholic Church are very serious, as a proportion of people who are in religious institutions, it's no higher than anyone else. And on the evidence that I could see, it was lower than the others. But they're still very serious crimes. But as you also point out, they're essentially historical crimes. So what the Royal Commission was really looking at is that events that had occurred within institutions between about 25 and 45 years prior to the Royal Commission commencing. So these were historical cases. Some of them overwhelmingly serious, obviously, but many of the allegations against that were made were with respect to people who had died because they were historical cases. The Royal Commission did not look at anything that was current within families, and it didn't focus much about current allegations within institutions either. The focus was predominantly historical.
And I think we would agree that wherever child sexual abuse occurs, whether it's in the church or anywhere, and no matter how far back it's gone, it's right and proper that this has been investigated. So not trying to sweep that under the carpet, but just to make the point, though, I think there's a perception in the Australian community when they look at Catholic priests or other church leaders that there's somehow a cloud hanging over these people.
Well, the worst offender within the Catholic Church, probably, or there might be one or two others, was Gerald Rizdow. He's the best known. Now, Rizdow's been in prison since 1995, and he's still there, and he's unlikely to ever come out. So many of these cases were acted upon. As I point out in the book, the Catholic Church made many errors. If you look at the state of Victoria where Rizdow was involved, but so did Victoria Police. Rizdow was known to Victoria Police 20 years before he was arrested. He had actually, according to the evidence, he'd actually assaulted a son of a police officer. This was well known, and I make the point in the book that it was well known. The Royal Commission sort of tended to evade the issue about Victoria Police and other police forces. But if you go back historically, I mean, sadly, some of these crimes weren't regarded then the way they are now. And Victoria Police's actions through the 70s or the 60s, 70s and 80s was highly remiss, because the two worst clerical offenders within the Catholic Church were a guy called Monsignor John Day and Rizdow. Day was never charged, although police knew about him, and it took them years to charge Rizdow. And from the moment he was charged, Rizdow pleaded guilty. So Rizdow has pleaded guilty to every allegation. And that's the reason why he's still in prison, because new allegations are made. He pleads guilty and he stays on. So the Catholic Church was remiss. Other churches were remiss. So were government institutions, in particular the police forces and some other institutions. And I make this point in the book that within Tasmania, where the Royal Commission didn't look, it looked at a non-Catholic school, looked at Hutchins School in Tasmania, did a case study on it, which I think it's an independent Christian school. I think it had a background in the Anglican Church. But there was rife offending within the state education department's government schools in Tasmania, and the Royal Commission didn't look at it. And there's now an independent inquiry in Tasmania looking at this very matter, which the Royal Commission avoided. But teachers within government schools were moved by the Education Department in Tasmania from school to school. They were covered up. There are now a number of people in prison. There are other charges pending. But to some extent, the Royal Commission, I think the general focus to people who were looking at it or following it, I think a lot of people would have thought this was an inquiry into the Catholic Church. And it appeared that way, and it wasn't completely that way. But that was the emphasis, and in particular, Cardinal Pell, to whom you refer and who the book focuses on. I mean, no one was quizzed the way Cardinal Pell was quizzed. For the last appearance, it was 19 hours. You add it all up, it's close to 30 hours. And no evidence was ever produced to involve him in any covering up, although allegations were made. But the Royal Commission couldn't produce any evidence. And I make the point in the book that some of their findings against Pell are simply contradictory. And I pointed out, and no one's come back to me and said that's wrong. And others denied him due process because they made findings against him, or they'd ask him to explain what happened in these circumstances. So that's the way it all ended up. But you go back to your original point. I mean, I think the whole of society is to blame for what occurred historically, and to some extent what's occurring today. Fortunately, action was taken, and within the Catholic Church, internationally, the first person to take action was Cardinal Pell in Melbourne, followed very closely by his fellow bishops in Sydney. So from around 1996, 1997, in Melbourne and Sydney and the rest of the Australian Catholic Church, the matter was being looked to. Now, you go to that film Spotlight on the Catholic Church in Boston. That film, that issue became prominent in the early part of this century, but the Catholic Church within Australia had gone in before the American Church, before the Irish Church, before the French and German churches. But even so, it copped a large amount of the blame within the Royal Commission for what
Gerard,
were historical crimes. Yeah,
that's right. No, and thank you. That context is really important and very much lost in the narrative. And this is why I think your book is such a valuable contribution, because you go into the detail very forensically. And I'll come in a moment to some of the reasons why there was this sort of get Pell pile on. But let's sort of fast forward now, past the Melbourne response, where Cardinal Pell, as Archbishop, or then Archbishop of Melbourne, instituted the Melbourne response, was starting to clean house and doing, a pretty good job in conjunction and collaboration with Victoria Police. But in March 2013, the Victorian Police set up Operation Tethering. No complaints had been made against Cardinal Pell. What was going on there, in your view?
Well, as you point out, early on in the 1990s, the Victoria Police had cooperated with the Catholic Church in Melbourne to resolve this problem. But there was a change in management in the Victoria Police, and the Victoria Police had behaved very badly and not investigating certain crimes. And mainly Graham Ashton, who became the Chief Commissioner, turned on the Catholic Church, dropped the cooperation. Before this part, there was a state parliamentary inquiry going on, and he dropped the cooperation.
And that's where he exaggerated the suicide numbers, allegedly as a result of clergy sexual abuse.
Well, in relation to the Ballarat Catholic Diocese, the figures were grossly exaggerated. Commissioner Ashton knew about this, but this wasn't revealed until 3 years later, when the Australian got a story about it, and he had given evidence to the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry in secret. So this matter was covered up. And what you had here was a very bad police performance. And then what happened was that Commissioner Ashton essentially turned on Cardinal Pell, who had been Archbishop of Melbourne until 2001, and when he went to Sydney, and he turned on Pell, and they set up Operation Tethering, which was an inquiry looking for a complainant. They didn't have a complainant. They didn't have a complainant for a year, and the first complainant they had come out of a psychiatric hospital the day before, and that complaint didn't last. And it wasn't until 2015 that they got a complaint, and those complaints really came after a lot of very hostile television programs and reporting, principally on the ABC and to some extent in the Melbourne Age, in the newspaper. But so they set up something looking for a crime, and it took them over 2 years to get one serious complainant.
And as you say, the media reporting was pretty crucial to getting or even soliciting these complaints, it would seem. Louise Milligan on the ABC, in particular, David Marr and others. Tell us about their role in Operation Tethering getting to where it ultimately got to in terms of laying charges against the Cardinal.
Well, I come to them briefly. The point is also that Victoria Police actually advertised for
that's right,
for potential complainants and victims, and this was covered in the Melbourne Age, the Herald Sun. They put out a leak on a Christmas Eve and said that if anyone had been offended in the cathedral between these two dates, and the dates were the dates when Cardinal Pell was the Archbishop of Melbourne, so they went looking for complainants in relation to this allegation for which Pell went to trial about crimes within St Patrick's Cathedral. And apart from the one complainant they already had, no one came forward. They didn't get any complainants because no one had been abused. I mean, it just didn't happen. So they went with the one that they had, and the one that related to another person who had died, and before he died, accidentally, he had said he'd never been sexually assaulted by anyone. Going back to the journalist, I mean, this starts essentially with David Marr's book on Pell, which was a kind of small autobiography, but mainly focused on allegations of child sexual assault. And then Louise Milligan took this up on the ABC with a full 30-minute program on 7:30 about allegations made about Pell, and then her book came out later, and it all just steamrolled. So you had the situation where the ABC was using two Pell antagonists who were hostile to Pell, Louise Milligan and David Marr, also as commentators on the case. So they were called in to comment on the Pell case, in spite of the fact they'd written very hostile books about Pell. I mean, this was simply unprofessional journalism. At the time I raised this with ABC management, as usual, the ABC dismissed it, says there was no problem here. But you had this great build-up, and other journalists as well joined in. But the principal ones were David Marr and Louise Milligan. And I mean, David Marr is hostile to the Catholic Church. He's also hostile to the Anglican Church. Louise Milligan was hostile to the Catholic Church. And in particular, Louise Milligan has a Catholic background, and some Catholics oppose Pell. But the reason why they opposed Pell essentially was not partly because he was a Catholic. Sorry about that. I thought I had that turned off. Partly because he was a Catholic, but predominantly because he was a conservative Catholic. And that's the point. I mean, the whole criticism, the people who were marked out in all this were not the liberals in the American sense of the term, but the conservatives. And the ABC had a shocking case of child abuse within its own organisation. Never covered that. You had people like Bob Ellis and others who, after their deaths, were revealed as people who were pedophiles. So was Richard Neville in his book Paper. He revealed himself. The ABC never worried about that. What they focused on was offenders, or possible offenders, or alleged offenders who were conservatives. Pell happened to be, he was a Catholic, but he's also a conservative Catholic.
Yeah, so clear. It would seem a clear case of bias here, and we'll come back to that towards the end of this discussion. During the course of all of this, you were one of the few people who would point out these sort of errors in your commentary, in your column in the Australian, in your appearances on the ABC's Insiders. At one point, Louise Milligan put out a tweet referring to you, saying, "I don't want to hear about his," i.e. Gerard Henderson's, pedophile protecting nonsense. That's a pretty serious allegation. How did that make you feel at the time?
Well, I'm used to criticism, and I don't really care very much. But I did raise that.
Pedophile protecting. I mean, doesn't get any lower than that.
Well, you can't. But I mean, I don't go to defamation. Yeah. A lot of people say very bad stuff about me. I mean, I wasn't going to. She accused me of defamation. I never defamed at all. She defamed me. I did nothing about it. But I did write to the go on. I did write to the ABC managing director, David Anderson, and I said, "Is this the kind of thing, calling someone a pedophile protector, you are comfortable for one of your most senior journalists to do? I mean, is this within the ABC's ethical and journalistic standards?" And David Anderson replied to me. He said, "Oh, I wasn't aware of this. I'll get back to you." He never did, because people like David Anderson, the managing director, they don't run the ABC. The ABC is a staff collective. It's run by people like Louise Milligan. I mean, all the various programs run themselves. And whilst David Anderson is paid to be managing director and editor-in-chief, he doesn't act as editor-in-chief. And in fact, the journalists run it themselves. So people like Sally Neighbour and Louise Milligan and all this group, that they run it. So look, it was highly offensive that Milligan fires off at people, and is like so many journalists, she's very happy to accuse other people, but say anything about her and she gets terribly offended. So the central point about Milligan was I wrote her a long letter, it's in the book when her book came out, and she never ever replied to any request. She only ever had soft interviews on the ABC or at literary festivals, and she never debated the Pell case with someone who knew something about the case who disagreed with her. She was a journalist who lacked intellectual courage, and I make that point in the book. But many do. Absolutely. I mean, because they like criticizing others, but they can't take criticism themselves.
Yeah, no, and that's very evident. You just also on this point of pedophile protecting. You mentioned David Marr and his defending of the photographer Bill Henson, who some years ago was embroiled in controversy because of his exhibitions of photographs that he had taken of topless 12-year-olds. So clearly there's, some sort of massive double standard going on here, I would think.
Well, I criticised Henson at the time that happened, and David Marr, in my newspaper column, and David Marr went on the ABC in Melbourne and criticised me. But the point I make in the book, and I quote some other people saying this as well, I mean, he then published a book on the case which contained photographs of Henson's photography of naked young 12-year-old girls. They were all girls. And I make the point, I mean, what if a Catholic bishop had published, who liked photography, had published a book or done photography, which had ended up in a book, which showed naked 12-year-old boys? I mean, what would Marr have said? Marr would have been outraged, but Marr defended Henson. Now, what we're talking about here is standards, and it's 10 years ago, and he may not do it again today. But Marr's opposition is always against conservatives. I mean, he's critical, as we know, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, any kind of conservative church he's critical of. And someone like Bill Henson, if he wants to take photographs, which is called art, of young prepubescent girls, well, that's okay, that's art. And someone else does it who's a conservative, that's not okay. So David Marr's got these principles, but like so many journalists, he can't stand criticism and gets very upset if you do criticize him. I have some examples in the book of Marr just reacting to what I said on Insiders and just going completely losing it in public.
No, I used to enjoy watching you and David on the couch, Gerard. It was very entertaining on Sundays. Gerard, could I move on now? There's so much detail in the book, and obviously we can't cover it all today in this interview. I hope this whets people's appetite to go and read your book. But if we just now move on to the High Court and its exoneration of Cardinal Pell, 7-0. And after that, and this was really disturbing, I thought, a number of prominent left-wing commentators refused to accept that Cardinal Pell had been declared innocent. Lucy Morris Marr of the New Daily, a news outlet owned by people's superannuation funds, referred to Cardinal Pell as a former convicted pedophile. Melissa Davey, in public conversation with David Marr, of whom we were just speaking, said to David Marr, he was never declared an innocent man by the High Court. I thought in our Western civilization we had a thing called presumption of innocence.
Well, we do accept that people would seem that left-wingers don't like. But what I mentioned in the book here, comments by Marr, Lucy Morris Marr, John Fain of The Age, Barry Cassidy of the ABC, made comments after the High Court decision which were totally, completely ignorant. They didn't understand the law, although Fain has a law degree. But and there is a presumption of innocence, which means that you're innocent unless you're proven guilty. Now, not only was Pell had his conviction quashed by the High Court, but it was a stunning 7-0 decision. So all 7 judges signed up to it. And it's a devastating critique of the Victorian Director of Public Prosecutions and of the 2 judges on the Victorian Court of Appeal who were in the majority who rejected Cardinal Pell's case. Now, in a sense, Cardinal Pell was saved by Justice Mark Weinberg, who dissented in the Court of Appeal. Weinberg's background is Jewish. He's not a Catholic. But it was a devastating 200-page judgment. And Weinberg is regarded, he's now off the court, but he was regarded as the most qualified criminal law jurist in the country. And it was such a compelling dissent that I thought if he did get right of appeal to the High Court, and he got something like that if he got out of Victoria into the High Court at that stage, his chances were good. And it's not a long judgment. It's a very well written judgment. You can find it online. But all the judges together, just the problem was the Victorian Director of Public Prosecutions and all the journalists, from Louise Milligan to David Marr to Lucy Morris Marr and all the others who were on the anti-Pell pylon, not one of them could explain how the crimes could have occurred after a solemn mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral on a Sunday where there were around 350 to 500 people in attendance, and when Pell was always accompanied, and how these assaults could have happened without anyone noticing them. It fell apart. And in the end, the Victorian Public Prosecutor, Director of Public Prosecutions, she just couldn't handle the case. And what I've done in my book is put in some of the stuff from the hearings, because there was the decision, but before the decision there were 2 days of hearings, and it's just embarrassing to read it because she just couldn't explain what happened. And so you have now the High Court is a bit different today. A couple of people have retired, but this was not a Conservative court. About half the court had been appointed by the Coalition, around half the court had been appointed by the Labor Party. The most senior, probably the most experienced judge in criminal law on the High Court when the Pell case came up was Virginia Bell. She's an ex-ABC presenter. She used to present Late Night Live. She's a kind of libertarian. But her criticisms of the Victorian Director of Public Prosecutions were devastating, because Virginia Bell was a very good lawyer. She was interested in, she understands the presumption of innocence. She understands the importance of evidence. And as Professor Gans of Melbourne University have said, that all 7 judges on the High Court knew more about the case than the Victorian Director of Public Prosecutions did, which is unusual because usually in one of these criminal law cases, one judge sort of runs it and the others follow in. But that didn't happen in this case. The Victorian Director of Public Prosecution couldn't explain the case. Louise Milligan couldn't explain it. David Marr couldn't explain it. Nobody could. And it was never explained. And because it wasn't explained because it didn't happen. But what people like Barry Cassidy and others are saying, the High Court didn't find him innocent. Well, only an ignorant person would say that because the High Court never finds anyone ignorant. No court innocent. No court finds any person innocent. They find them not guilty beyond reasonable doubt. That's all. That's the standard. So Barry Cassidy and others bring up this other standard. It's just completely ignorant to say that they didn't find Pell innocent. They had no capacity to find Pell innocent, but all 7 judges did say that there was a reasonable assumption that an innocent man had been convicted. That goes as far as any court has ever gone in effectively saying someone's innocent.
Yeah, and you'd never know that from the media commentary. You do go into amazing detail about what happened in St Patrick's Cathedral there, and there were obviously journalists covering the various court cases, but they didn't do their job. There should have been commentary about why it was physically impossible, why the times didn't add up, why the prosecution couldn't even establish the dates on which the alleged offending occurred. The defence had to give them the dates. All of this sort of stuff was going on. It's a failure of journalism. It's a failure of the law. It's a failure of the public prosecutors, etc. You mentioned, you have a reference in the book to Walter Duranty, which I thought was fascinating because he was the famous New York Times reporter in Moscow who refused to see the Ukrainian famine, and I think George Orwell came and reported on that, yet he won a Pulitzer Prize and never gave it back. Now, there's been error after error, particularly by the media, but also by the legal fraternity. This is Walter Duranty, although it's history repeating itself, is it not?
Yes, it is. Well, people like Louise Milligan and others won prizes for their book. Milligan won a couple of prizes for her book, Cardinal, but it's just replete with errors. And it's been demolished by the High Court decision. But journalists don't apologise. And Duranty was shocking because this was at the time of Stalin's effectively purge against Ukraine, a forced famine. Probably some millions died, possibly 4 or 5 million died. And Duranty went through the Soviet Union at the time and said what a wonderful place it was. I mean, he was not only an incompetent journalist, he was just an unmitigated liar. And Malcolm Muggeridge soon after wrote it up, and Orwell commented on him. But Muggeridge just demonstrated that what Duranty saw, because Muggeridge had gone to the Soviet Union around the same time, and he just said what Duranty saw wasn't what Muggeridge saw. Yep. But he got all these prizes. He got a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the Soviet Union under Stalin in the early 30s. And there's hardly anything in it that's true.
You say in the book, Gerard, you say in the book that people wanted to believe what they wanted to believe. That was what Duranty was doing about the Soviet Union. The left wanted to believe this utopia could exist. The left in modern-day Australia wanted to believe that the church is this evil institution that must be brought down. And this is what we are seeing in the absence of evidence.
Well, that's right. I mean, what we've got increasingly this way that journalists who have become activists. Now, journalists who are not activists examine the evidence and comment on the evidence. But journalists who are activists try to build the case for the prosecution, which is what Milligan did, which is what David Marr did, Lucy Morris-Marr did, Melissa Davey did, and many others. And they get into this area where they believe what they want to believe. So if someone tells you something and it's consistent with your narrative, you believe them. But as I point out in the book, I mean, some of these, you just can't believe what people tell you. Some people tell the truth. Some people exaggerate. Some people lie. But many people have memories of events that never happened. This is very common. I made a point in the book on a totally unrelated matter about 3 well-known Australians who have clear memories about their life of events that never happened. Now, they're not liars. Some people are liars. I make the point that Carl Beach, the British guy who made all these allegations about Edward Heath and all these other senior British politicians, he was a chronic liar. He made allegations of child sexual abuse, and he's now serving a long prison term for those offences. But most people are not liars, but people have bad memories. They have memories of events that never happened. And so just because someone comes up to you and said, oh, look, I saw George Pell doing this, the response is to say, well, that's interesting. I'll have a look at that, but I'll also would like to ask you about these matters, and I will go and ask someone else if they saw something similar at the same time. They didn't do it. But more importantly, nor did Victoria Police. I mean, on this, Pell went to prison on 5 charges, convicted on 5 charges. There were 4 on one event, and there was one alleged to have taken place in December, and there was one alleged to have taken place the following February. Now, before the Victorian Magistrates Court, the senior Victorian Inspector Reid, told the court that the final charge on which Pell was convicted, this is earlier on, he told it the Magistrates Court, they'd never investigated. So Pell got charged and convicted with a conviction upheld, passed on by the Magistrates Court, a conviction upheld by 2 judges out of 3 in the Victorian Court of Appeal for a crime which was never, alleged crime, which was never investigated. I mean, this is absolutely extraordinary. But that's what happened. And I don't make stuff up. I mean, as you know, the book is just full of quotes and evidence and citations. I don't make it up. I mean, that's what he said. On another occasion, the police was asked why he didn't investigate something. He said, well, I didn't do it because I didn't do it. Now, that's if you tried that in primary school, the teacher would pull you up and say, well, you can't say I didn't do that because I didn't do it. You've got to give a reason why you didn't do it. But that didn't necessarily. So Victoria Police does that. That gets through the Magistrates Court. It gets through the prosecution. It gets through 2 of the most senior judges in Victoria, the Chief Justice and the President of the Court of Appeal. And eventually it's knocked over by the High Court. But it's an absolute scandal they ever got that far. But
Gerard, I think that answers a question from one of our viewers who's put a comment in the live stream. What reason would the victim have for making up the story is what Jim Bell says. And I think, it's this issue of perhaps faulty memory.
We don't know why. I've never said the complainant is a liar. I've never said that. But I have said that, in my view, the complainant has a recollection of an event that never happened. But I'd go into an example because I've got an example of Kevin Rudd when he was Prime Minister saying he remembered going to a Test cricket match in Brisbane when Colin Cowdery was playing in the 74-75 series. Now, Cowdery didn't play in that game. He played his first Test in Melbourne in that series. Now, Kevin Rudd had this clear recollection of watching Lilly and Thompson bowling into Cowdery. Cowdery wasn't there. Now, Kevin Rudd's not a liar, but he's mistaken, and people have recollections of events that never happened. There was one case in the Victorian Court of Appeal. The Tyrrell case is only a couple of years old, where Tyrrell was convicted. He was cleared by a different set of judges in the Victorian Court of Appeal, but the complainant in that instance admitted to the court that one of the allegations on which the person had been convicted was charged with came from one of his dreams. He said he conceded he had a dream. Now, people have dreams. Memory is memory is.
And that's why the court process is important. You've got to be able to establish timelines, and otherwise anyone can go to jail.
Henrik saying in the case of Carl Bitch, he said, when someone makes an allegation, you've got to say, we regard that very seriously, but we're going to go and check it. And it would have been better for the complainant in this instance, as Frank Brennan has said in his book, if the police had gone back to him and said, well, hang on, what you're saying here doesn't really hold forward. What you're saying here is contradicted what you told us 6 months before, and talked it through. And it would have been better for everyone if they'd worked it out and then not gone to these extreme and then have the situation of it's all thrown out. I don't think it was good for complainants generally. I can see that overwhelming majority of complainants are accurate and telling the truth and accurate, but not everyone is. And as Justice Mark Weinberg said in the Court of Appeal, juries almost always get it right. And he said, and the emphasis on almost, they usually get it right, but they don't always get it right. And we don't know why people make claims about other people. And in the whole book, I make no hostile comment to the complainant. And I quote George Pell at the front of the book saying that he bears no ill will to the complainant. But if you're going to say that Pell did the crimes which he's alleged to have done, someone has to say how he could possibly do them on the evidence that was presented to the court. And the Victorian Director of Public Prosecutions couldn't explain it. You've got to say it can't be explained. If it can't be explained, it didn't happen.
No, that's right. And that, again, that's why we have standards of evidence, why we have a court system which is well established over hundreds of years. Gerard, you've been very generous with your time. I do want to ask a couple more questions to finish off. But there is a comment from Tom Zevin in the live stream, which I do want to take on. We probably can't really answer the question, but I want to acknowledge it. He says, as a past student of St. Patrick's College, and someone when 13 who was directly approached by children who were being sexually abused at St. Alpius, claiming that Pell was complicit, ! What do you say to this?
It's an obvious school?
Yeah, and again,
what I've said to this, well, St. Patrick's College in Melbourne closed, I think, in 1968. So that school's been closed for nearly 60 years. There's never been an allegation of Pell ever assaulting students at St. Alpheus. Pell did not.
I think Tom Zevin is saying that perhaps Pell was complicit. Perhaps he's alleging that Pell was involved.
Well, hang on. Let me just go back to that. Pell never taught at St. Alpheus. He never taught at any school. He just lived in the parish for 1 year, as priests do. And Paul Bongiorno lived in a parish with Rizdow for 1 year in Warrnambool. Pell did for 1 year in Ballarat East. Pell never taught at the school. There were no allegations. The only allegation I've covered in the book about Pell was in relation to St. Patrick's. We're talking. Oh, is he talking about St. Patrick's in Ballarat? I thought he was talking about St. Patrick's in Melbourne. Okay, St. Patrick in Ballarat. There was one allegation about a priest, not of sexual assault. Pell said to the Royal Commission, look, he probably should have handled it differently. He spoke to the chaplain. Perhaps he should have spoken to the principal. But you have to bear in mind that he was a diocesan priest, and the dioceses don't run the religious orders. And all that's covered in the book. But there are no other allegations about Pell because he didn't really have any relationship with the school. He wasn't involved with the school. I'm sorry, I thought he meant St. Patrick's.
Yeah, no, he does come back.
He means St. Patrick's. Well, the problem is you've got a cathedral and a school, St. Patrick's, in both cities in Melbourne. But I mean, you just can't make those kind of allegations. I mean, just because someone says something about something, you've got to say, well, did it happen? And Pell had 19 hours in the Royal Commission, and no one made that allegation about a school. I mean, they were pretty hostile to Pell, but in the end, Peter McClellan had no evidence, and his colleagues. So when you don't have evidence, you use terms like it was untenable that Pell didn't know this. It's unlikely. It's impossible. These terms aren't evidence. There was never any evidence, and had there been evidence, he would have been charged, I assume. And he wasn't charged with those offences. So the only charges he faced no charges in relation to any school at Ballarat. He faced charges that were withdrawn about a swimming pool in Ballarat, and they were thrown out. And he faced charges about St. Patrick's Cathedral. But the school at Ballarat, I mean, I'm not. But
no, that's fine, Gerard. I appreciate it. I think
anyone can say anything they like. Anyone can come up and say something, but the evidence is a check. But I mean, I've read through all this stuff. I mean,
no, you're absolutely forensic, Gerard. Just to finish, Gerard, I think this whole Pell case, for those of us who are social conservatives, some of us have been involved in public commentary on issues that run counter to our culture, the left-wing narrative, and it's a hostile, toxic environment many times. Cardinal Pell being convicted in this way, it certainly sent shockwaves through me, because I thought, if the left-wing lynch mob, the media pylon that you so well document, can get someone as outspoken on cultural conservatism, on Christianity as Cardinal Pell, then none of us are safe. If the High Court hadn't overturned his conviction, what do you think the environment would be like now in Australia for people like myself and others who like to speak out on these cultural issues?
Well, it would be pretty dire, I would say, because it would mean you can be charged and convicted and have your conviction upheld in a very senior court in Victoria on the basis of no evidence. So it would be very dire. Now, I make the point in the book, and I mention you in the book, that a lot of Pell's supporters, or people who thought he wasn't guilty beyond reasonable doubt, were not Catholics. And this idea, I mean, certainly some Catholics supported him. Many Catholics opposed him, or people who brought up Catholics like Paul Bongiorno and Barry Cassidy and Louise Milligan, they opposed him. So it wasn't a row between the Catholics and those who were not Catholics or anything. It was really a dispute between someone who felt that a conservative was being picked on because he was a conservative. And I quote Thomas Keneally in the book, and he did an introduction to one of Louise Milligan's books. And I quote Keneally's complaint was about climate change and economic policy and stuff. And this is mentioned in his condemnation of Pell. I mean, maybe Keneally's right, maybe Keneally's wrong, and it had nothing to do with what Pell was charged with. So I think what would have happened is that any conservative who put their head up and one allegation's made against them, can get put away. So I think it would have been dire. And I think what's important about the Pell case, and in a way, I think it was probably, he wouldn't see it this way, but I mean, it was probably better it went through the way it went through, because what was emphatic is a 7-0 decision in the High Court, and a well-written decision, easy to read. No one's criticised it because there's no way of finding holes in it based on the lack of evidence. But I think without the High Court, and as I said, the High Court was a divided court. It's got left of centre people on it, it's got right of centre people on it, but all 7 came together and said no. And I think it was great for Australian society in the sense that it meant that people couldn't be picked on because they were conservative, because they were intellectually unfashionable. Now, in the general community, that's a different thing. We're talking about people who run the media, people who run the prosecution services, lawyers and stuff. What's important there is that the High Court said, no, this has gone too far. And for the reasons the High Court explained. Yeah.
Gerard, just finally, you finished the book with a little bit of a swipe at cowardly journalists, and what's your cowardly politicians? My apologies. We've talked about the journalists, but the politicians, and this again distressed me and continues to concern me about our public discourse, is that our people are fearful of speaking up in the public square because of what's happened to Cardinal Pell. Because of what happens to you being called a pedophile protector, all this mud is thrown. What do we need? It's a bit of a Dorothy Dixon, but what do we need to be doing? Those of us who care about Australia's cultural direction, those who care about the Christian ethos, the family, the pro-life issues. What's the lesson that we need to take out of what's just happened, and this victory that's happened towards one who's on our side of our thinking?
Well, as you know, Lyle, it's tough. It's tough being unfashionable in the circles that you and I mix in, but you just got to stand up. And all the great Christian leaders in the past stood up, and many great secular leaders stood up. Yeah. The anti-communists stood up. That wasn't fashionable to be an anti-communist in university circles when I was a student either. And many of my good friends like Frank Knopfenmacher and Hugo Wolfson, who are older than me, were very strong anti-communists. Neither were a Catholic. They both have Jewish background. So, and I just make the point about Pell. I mean, Pell got through, but very few people, a lot of people thought he was treated unfairly. Very few people were prepared to stand up. And I can understand why, particularly for a politician. It's very difficult for a politician to stand up. But enough people stood up to keep a doubt about the case until it got to the High Court. And if some people hadn't stood up, and it wasn't very many of us, and you were one of them, but there were enough to raise doubts about the case. And so I think the only lesson is that however tough it is to be unfashionable, however tough it is to be criticised by people unfairly about your alleged motives and whatever else, the thing to do is get up and proclaim what you believe to be the truth. And if you're wrong, people will correct you. But what I notice in relation to this book, and it's been out now 2 months, that the people I criticise in the book, David Marr, Louise Milligan, Lucy Morris-Marr, Melissa Davey, Paul Bongiorno, Barry Cassidy, John Fain, no one on the ABC has come to me and said, you're wrong there. And the ABC managing director has said to me just yesterday, and that'll be published in the My Media Watchdog shortly. He said, look, we covered it right. And I'm going to go back and say, well, you covered it right because you set up your own inquiry and they said you were fine. But if a few people hadn't stood up, it would have been a dire circumstances for all of us. So all I can say is, bite the bullet and be strong. That's the message.
Well, Gerard, thank you so much for writing this book. That's it there, Cardinal Pell, The Media Pylon and Collective Guilt. It's available through Connaught Publishing, through their website, presumably through the Sydney Institute as well, Gerard?
You can get it through the Sydney Institute, just on our website, and also bookshops and most of the major distribution channels. But you won't read about it or hear about it or see about it on the ABC. I can guarantee you. And nor did Frank Brennan, and nor did Keith Windschuttle. So the three of us did books. Windschuttle got 2 interviews. Frank Brennan got none. I've got none. The ABC is just covering up its own mess. But you can buy the book, folks. But Connaught is a very good publisher, and you can get it here and elsewhere. I support bookshops. I don't want you to walk away from the bookshop. We've got to keep our bookshops going. So it is in bookshops, and if it's not there, a bookshop will order it. Yeah.
Well, thanks again, Gerard, for your generosity with your time, for the service you've done to the conservative and Christian cause in emboldening us by providing this detail. All the best, Gerard. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Okay, bye.